Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. Last week, I spent some time reflecting on the skills that speech and debate cultivate at a moment when many of those same capacities, careful listening, intellectual flexibility, argumentation, audience awareness, and the ability to engage disagreement thoughtfully, feel increasingly rare in public life. I meant every word of that. Competitive forensics shaped me profoundly, both personally and professionally. And I continue to believe deeply in the value of those activities for students. But I've also realized over the years that the environments that can sharpen us most intensely often leave behind habits and instincts that follow us long after we leave them. And for people who spent years inside of debate culture, one of those lingering instincts can be a deep comfort with intellectual clash itself. In many ways, this episode is a continuation of last week's conversation, but from a more reflective and personal angle. Because while debate teaches extraordinary communication skills, leadership and adulthood eventually require learning something else too. Not everyone experiences disagreement, critique, and rhetorical sparring in quite the same way. Now, again, when most people hear speech and debate, they tend to picture public speaking competitions, students in suits, maybe current events or political arguments, and certainly all of that is part of the deal. But people who lived inside that world know it is also something else entirely. It is an intense communication culture built around critique, analysis, persuasion, and clash. Weekend after weekend, round after round, you stand in front of judges and receive written evaluations on everything from your arguments, to your delivery, to your organization, to your strategic decisions. Sometimes feedback is encouraging. And sometimes it's, brutally candid. And in high-level programs, especially at the collegiate level where I competed, the culture often rewards directness over delicacy because the underlying assumption is simple. If you want to improve, you need honest feedback. Now, debate especially conditions people to become comfortable with argumentation in ways that are, probably unusual compared to most professional or social environments. You learn to anticipate objections before they arrive. You learn to work both sides of an issue. You can spend one round passionately defending a position and the next round attacking that exact same position with equal intensity. You learn to pressure test ideas, search for loopholes, identify contradictions, and think several moves ahead. And after a while, that way of engaging with ideas begins to feel normal. More than normal, honestly. It can actually become energizing. And one of the things I've reflected on more as I've moved through leadership roles is that people from debate and forensics backgrounds sometimes experience what I think of as a kind of intellectual sparring instinct. Rigorous disagreement does not necessarily feel threatening. In many cases, it feels collaborative, engaged, alive even. Some of my favorite conversations over the years have involved people pushing back hard on ideas, working through contingencies, challenging assumptions, and stress-testing arguments from every possible angle. In those moments, disagreement feels less like conflict and more like sharpening, less like hostility and more like trust. The implicit message is that everyone at the table is capable of handling a serious exchange of ideas. The challenge, of course, is realizing that not everyone experiences communication that way. That's probably been one of the most important leadership lessons of my adult life, one that I find myself day by day still learning. Because in debate culture, clash often signals engagement. Outside of those environments, clash can feel personal or intimidating or exhausting. What feels to one person like collaborative problem solving may feel to another person like interrogation. And I think people who come from high-rigor communication cultures can sometimes miss that disconnect because we genuinely do not experience the interaction as hostile. We experience it as productive. But the older I get, the more I realize how much different environments create different communication norms. In some spaces, intellectual intensity is interpreted as care. In others, reassurance and affirmation are the primary relational signals. Neither is inherently right or wrong, but misunderstanding those differences can create friction that nobody intended. I also think leadership complicates this further because authority changes the emotional weight of communication. Questions land differently when they come from the leader in the room. What feels exploratory to you may feel evaluative to someone else. What feels like collaborative sparring may feel like defending one's competence. And that realization has forced me to think more intentionally about pacing and calibration in conversations. Debate culture trains people to immediately stress test ideas. Leadership, though, sometimes requires allowing ideas room to breathe before interrogating every vulnerability in them. People often need psychological ownership before they're ready for analytical pressure. And to be clear, I don't think the lesson here is to abandon rigor or avoid disagreement. In fact, I worry sometimes that modern discourse swings too far in the opposite direction, where disagreement itself becomes uncomfortable and critique is interpreted as a personal rejection. Because healthy organizations, healthy schools, healthy democracies even require people who can engage ideas honestly and thoughtfully. But I do think there is a difference between sharpening ideas and overwhelming people. And that distinction matters. I've also realized over time that some of the habits reinforced in competitive environments can quietly overextend themselves in leadership settings. Debate rewards completeness, precision, rebuttal, and anticipating every possible counterargument. Leadership often requires clarity, emotional steadiness, and the ability to create space for other people to contribute imperfectly. Those are not always the same skill set. And honestly, I think many people who spent years in debate, law, academia, journalism, engineering, politics, or other highly analytical cultures probably experience versions of this same tension. The very environments that teach you how to think sharply can also train you to engage with a level of intensity that not everyone shares. I suspect that's why some people who love rigorous exchange often unintentionally seek it out. Intellectual sparring can become psychologically familiar. It creates stimulation, engagement, and momentum. It feels like home. But leadership maturity involves recognizing that what energizes one person may very well drain another. For me, at least, that realization has not meant rejecting the influence of forensics and debate. I owe those activities a tremendous amount. They taught me confidence, adaptability, audience awareness, resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to communicate under pressure. They shaped my career and in many ways shaped who I became. But I do think adulthood and leadership require a second layer of growth beyond competitive communication itself. It requires learning when to press and when to pause, when to sharpen and when to reassure, when rigorous disagreement is productive and when people simply need clarity, trust, or space. In debate, the goal is often to win the argument. In leadership, that goal is often to help people think together well enough that progress becomes possible. Those are related skills, but they are not identical ones. And maybe, just maybe, part of growing beyond the environments that formed us is learning not only the strengths they gave us, but also the instincts they reinforce so deeply that we no longer notice them until years later. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.